Cliff and I have been playing the same game of tag for over 15 years now. It's just a dumb kid's game. Yeah, I'm terrified for my life. It began the summer before secondary school. Cliff had just moved to Sheffield, a few streets from my house. I saw him at the park a few times by himself. One day, he simply walked over and asked if I wanted to play a game of tag. I agreed, and we've stayed friends ever since. All through our teenage years, the gap year, and university, we've kept this game of tag bubbling between us. Why? I could never muster a satisfying answer. I guess we were both competitive people. We liked to win, and nobody lost as long as the game kept going. After university, I had to move to London to chase my dreams of being a cinematographer. Cliff was staying put. He had a life here now. He'd been seeing Olivia for a couple of years by that point, and things were getting serious. During our farewell, he hugged me close before tapping me on the shoulder. "Tag, you're it," he whispered. We promised to see each other every few weeks, but life got in the way like it always does. My career semi-took off, and Cliff started a family with Olivia, giving birth to their first child, Rosie. The game became an excuse to visit each other for our birthdays. We'd surprise the birthday boy by turning up unannounced and tagging them. This went on for many years, the element of surprise fading into the background. It was simply an excuse to keep our friendship alive. A few years back, I had some time off between the projects without much to do. I hadn't heard from Cliff for a while, so I decided to genuinely surprise him for his birthday. The plan? Turning up on his doorstep a week early, tagging him, and then demanding we go out and get drunk. I packed up my camper van and drove to Sheffield. It felt like the perfect plan, but it turned out to be the worst decision of my life. It was 8 p.m. by the time I parked up outside Cliff's house. The place was dark, but Cliff's car was parked in the driveway. I watched the house for a few minutes to see if anyone was home. A figure walked by one of the bay windows of the living room, still shrouded in darkness. Somebody was home. I crept up the drive and went to knock on the door. Just as my knuckles were about to strike, Cliff appeared in the doorway, dressed as if we were about to head out. From his expression, he was just as surprised as I was. "What the hell?" he said, his expression frozen in stern shock. I threw my hands up and smiled. "Surprise!" He didn't say anything for a while. He just stared at me, his mouth forming into a slight grimace. I slowly leaned forward, extended my finger, and jabbed him in the chest. "Tag, you're it," I said. "Does Olivia know you're coming?" "No, but you can't just drop in like this," he said. "That's why I bought my camper van. I'll sleep in there tonight. I just want a couple of beers. Let me talk to Olivia. I'm sure I can convince her," I said. Cliff shook his head and yanked the front door closed with some force. "She's taken Rosie to see her mum for the week. Her grandpa is on his last legs." "Oh, sorry to hear that," I said, waiting for the appropriate amount of time before speaking again. "But am I right in thinking that means you're free tonight?" I gave him my best shitting-eating grin. Cliff looked back at the door, then at me, and then kicked some mud off his shoes like a bashful kid. "Fine, a couple of pints, no more. I've got a busy day tomorrow," he said. After 6 beers, Cliff was in a much better mood. He seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. I knew his job was tough, something complicated with finance. Great pay, but terrible work-life balance. And raising a kid can't be easy. But now he was cracking jokes, buying tequila shots, and even sneaking a few cheeky cigarettes from me. It felt like we were teenagers again, just two best friends enjoying each other's company. Cliff came stumbling back to the table, 2 pints sloshing in his hands. He slumped into the stool next to me and slapped me on my back. "You really got me, man," he slurred. I wrapped my arm around his shoulder. "I was always the better player," I said. That always used to wind him up. He smiled at me like a banshee, all teeth and gums. "I'm gonna get you when you least expect it," he said, his tone almost musical. It took us twice the time to get home, with multiple sick and piss stops along the way. Our conversation dwindled as we eventually arrived at his house. I unlocked the camper van and went to step in. "You can come in if you want," he said. The first words he'd spoken in the last 10 minutes. His tone was desperate, like the lonely kid I met on the playing field all those years ago. My vision was spinning like a merry-go-round. "I don't think I'll make it. I need to sleep." "You sure?" he asked. I nodded, causing a sharp pain behind my right eye. The hangover headache was already creeping across my skull. He was working the next day, so I promised not to disturb him. I had a long drive back anyway, and needed a few pit stops to pick up snacks and question my life choices before getting home. We hugged goodbye, and he squeezed me tight. I thought I was going to be sick. A week later, I thought I would be sick again, but for a very different reason. Back at home, I was prepping for a shoot when the police called me. Did I know I'd spent the night with a murderer? The police told me Cliff had stabbed Olivia and Rosie the morning before I visited. 1 minute he was having breakfast with his family, the next he was puncturing holes into both of them with a fillet knife. Their blood was still oozing all over the kitchen tiles by the time I arrived just a few hours later. He'd left them there to rot while we got drunk together. The police almost seemed delighted to talk to me, certain that I could shed some light on the case. That certainly was quickly replaced with the mild shock and deep frustration. I told them we'd spent the whole night together, and that I'd noticed absolutely nothing. Cliff seemed fine. Better than fine. He seemed great. There was no motive, no suspects and no leads. One thing was for certain. They'd been a happy family. No evidence of secret affairs or hidden debts. It was like Cliff simply decided to detonate the life he'd spent so long building. I loved Olivia and Rosie, and now they'd been wiped away from the planet by someone I called my best friend. I spent the next few weeks in a daze, replaying the night endlessly in my mind, searching for clues to what would have happened to my friend of 15 years. You'd think all that time with someone would mean that you'd get a grasp on the kind of person they are. What a joke. We all wear masks, but some are hiding uglier faces than others. So much of that night was a blur. It was hard to piece it all together, but there was one moment that I couldn't shake. I'm gonna get you when you least expect it. Was Cliff still playing tag with me? The police said he'd gone into hiding somewhere in the Peak District. They were searching high and low, but they hadn't found a clue yet. He'd packed nothing and left on foot. The lead officer believed he'd gone out to the woods to die, that we'd find his body washed up in a ditch somewhere. I knew better. If there was still a hint of the old Cliff out there, he'd be plotting to get me back. He never liked to lose. And while he was it, he was losing. Months went, and still nobody knew where Cliff had gone. I knew he hadn't gone far. He was out there, waiting for the best opportunity to strike. I shed friends and jobs like a dying snake. I couldn't leave the house, knowing there was a chance he was still out there. He'd appear in busy crowds, smiling just like he did when I saw him after he'd murdered his family. Sometimes the crowds would part, and I'd realise that it wasn't Cliff. Other times his features, now gaunt and wild, remained unchanged. One night, I was in my office, reviewing some footage for a new film I was working on. I looked out of my window, and there he was, crouched by my shed, obscured by shadows. I told myself it was just a trick of my mind, but then I saw his face, pale, white, and illuminated by the full moon. He was smiling. I grabbed my phone off the desk and called the police, but by the time they'd picked up, he was gone. Months turned to years, and Cliff still hadn't been found. Police had uncovered some human remains in a cave a few miles outside of Sheffield, but hadn't been able to identify who it was or how long they'd been there. Interest in the story dwindled, and everyone moved on to the next violent atrocity. Even I had stopped seeing him so much, except for the occasional nightmare. My bank account had dried up, and I needed to find work. I spent the last of my savings on a therapist to untangle me from the web of shame and paranoia that kept me trapped inside my house. Questions still plagued me. How was I meant to trust someone again? Do we ever really know the people we love? What made Cliff do what he did? I came to accept that I would never find out the answers. After many long and painful sessions, I finally started to feel like a shell of a normal human. I was able to leave the house, look people in the eye, and begin to rebuild my life. But the guilt never left. Even after all the pain I'd been through, at least I was still alive. That's more than can be said about Olivia and Rosie. I celebrated with the man who wiped them from the world and spent the night sleeping next to their corpses. I needed to move on from this nightmare, and the only way to do that was to say a final goodbye. I packed up my camper van and headed to Sheffield, to the cemetery where they were both buried. It was a cold, bitter winter morning. The wind tugged at my hair and clothes as I marched along the endless rows of crumbling graves, desperately searching for Olivia and Rosie. I eventually found them, tucked away in a quiet corner underneath a great oak tree. The wind screamed through its branches, creating a ceaseless white noise. I tried concentrating on the names carved on the graves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart was racing. Why had I come here? A branch snapped behind me. I spun around. It was a squirrel watching me from a few rows along. It cocked its head at me before running as fast as it could in the other direction. There wasn't another soul in the entire cemetery. I was utterly alone. I took a deep breath and looked back at the names, Olivia and Rosie. I said I was sorry, and replaced the crusted remains of some old flowers with the fresh daffodils I'd bought. Clearly, nobody had visited them in a long time. Something deep in my gut told me that Cliff was gone. He'd lost his mind and starved to death in the middle of some woods. The end of an unexplainable tragedy. I said goodbye to all three of them that day and drove home. But sometimes, your gut instinct can be wrong. So very, very wrong. Last week, I was at a house party against my will. My newish girlfriend had dragged me there and told me it would be fun. It was anything but. I'd necked a bottle of wine in less than an hour, and the queue to the toilet was 4 people deep. My bladder isn't what it used to be, so I snuck out into the garden to find a secluded spot. As I stepped outside, the floodlight illuminated the garden in a stark white. I crept to a shadowy corner. After a few seconds, the garden turned black as the floodlight switched off. For a while, all I could hear was the sound of my own piss. Then I heard the pattering of feet behind me. They were rushing at full pace. The floodlight switched back on. I spun around. A naked figure was running across the garden towards me. It was Cliff, and he was coming fast. His body lean and muscular like an animal. His skin was smeared in dirt and muck. Same old, some new, with a long scrappy beard and greasy hair. He grinned at me with missing teeth. His thick right arm was outstretched. His dark eyes glinted in the moonlight. 5 giant fingers stabbed my chest, sending a jolt of sharp pain across my ribs. The force pushed me back against the garden fence. I tried to let out a scream, but it got caught in my throat. Cliff put his face up close to mine, his rotten breath stinging my nostrils. "Tag, you're it," he said. He leant across me and took a deep breath by my neck as if savouring my scent for the final time. Then he leapt back and ran back across the garden at a horrific speed, disappearing over the garden fence. I whimpered as I slid down the fence, trying to hold back the tears. Nobody believes me, not even the police. I can't lose more years of my life hiding away in my house. Cliff is still out there, alive. Someone needs to stop him. I can't keep living like this. Please. I'm sort of a nature guy. I say sort of because I'm not a nature guy, but I spend a considerable amount of time outside. It's mostly downloading music and going for hikes in my area, that sort of nature guy. That is why I consider myself fortunate that my backyard borders miles of forest. This is fortunate because I live in a very suburban area where most people are rationed only a few feet of neatly groomed yard. My backyard isn't large, but once I cross the threshold of bushes and trees, I'm met with unearthed stones that create mock canyons. I get to walk along skinny, running creeks of water. Some of the rock formations just up and forms overhangs, where I can sit under to get out of the heat. It is really a gift to have all of this behind my house. I've never had a reason to feel anything but serenity out there. But as of a few months ago, that serenity has taken on the guise of uneasy anticipation that something horrible happened out there. About 3 months ago, I went as deep into the woods as I had ever gone. I probably made my way through the trailless woods for about 3 hours. I was following a creek that was a stone or two away from being dammed up, but I muscled on anyway when something caught my attention. There was the base of a man-made stone structure. I went over to investigate. The structure was a dark grey rock that had patches of green moss running up it. I thought to myself that it must have been an old fire pit, or maybe a well of sorts. But what the hell did I know? There was no one around for miles, so the structure had to be really old. I was about to keep on following the creek when it clicked with me. The structure was a chimney. The top of a chimney. At first I was in disbelief. There was no way it could be that. I started to dig away at the base of the chimney, and it kept on revealing more and more chimney, no matter how much dirt I moved away. I eventually got down on my knees and started moving the dirt away using a nearby rock to break it up. I went on, strangely invested in seeing its end, when I struck roof shingles. Yes, a few inches below the dirt, there were roof shingles. I didn't know whether to think it was cool or terrifying. I hadn't decided yet. However, I did know that I was going to come back with some towels and move more dirt away, because at that time, I hadn't been completely freaked. The next weekend, I hiked back out to the house. The house had been on my mind almost obsessively. I made my way out with a newly bought pickaxe and a shovel from my garage. After a pretty rough few hours, I made it to the house. I was able to remember its location using the creek as a guiding reference. For the rest of the day, I dug at the ground at a grueling pace. Yet sure enough, a full-size roof was being revealed. When I had just enough time to make it back before sundown, I decided to go back home. But I left the tools propped up on the chimney. I was exhausted, and drinking some water I had bought, when I noticed how eerily quiet everything was. No animal chatter, no wind, just the persistent trickle of the creek. No, there was one more sound. It was muffled, but I followed it. It was a radio, and it was coming from the house. I pressed up against the roof and listened hard. The hum of a radio could be heard inside the house. Someone had to be living inside that house. I suddenly felt a sense of dread. I felt a sense of being miles from home and potentially not alone. I left immediately and made a leg-numbing trek back to my house. About 2 months later, I went back one last time. Curiosity got the best of me, and I wish I could say that I was smart enough and forgot about it. But come on, could you forget about this? I made it out to the house. It was the exact same way I'd left it, tools and all. There was no radio playing though. I had gone out there early, so I had time. I got to work on digging out the roof. I dug a pathway to the edge of where I thought the roof would be, so I could dig down to the side of the house. Relatively quickly, I made it to the edge, and began down. I worked hard with great focus, until I had about an inch of window exposed. I stuck my head into the hole, to press up against the tiny sliver of the window, but I couldn't make out anything. I dug for nearly an hour more, until I had the window almost completely exposed. I pushed up on the window, and to my surprise, it slid open with ease as if it were new. The earth I was lying in fell away, and I tumbled down into the house. It was dark, but my eyes were adjusting. I sat up. The light outside illuminated the room, and to my shock, the whole house was completely furnished, and seemed like it was lived in and managed. The room I was in must have been a guest room. It was decorated in a very 2000 era fashion. Somehow the house had airflow too, and with my eyes now adjusted, I made my way to the bedroom door. I grabbed the knob and slowly turned it. The door didn't even creak as I peeked into the hallway. I couldn't see much, but I heard something. This time, it wasn't a radio. it was someone crying. The hallway had an off-white coloured carpet flooring and a wooden staircase that led to the presumed first floor. Down the stairs, I could hear the gentle cries of a woman. I froze up. I wanted to call out for her, but I knew I'd crossed a personal boundary of mine hours ago when I decided to come out here. I must have been locked up for a minute or so when a new sound was born. Footsteps. And they were coming up the stairs, fast. I quickly shut the door and made a hard turn towards the window. I scrambled anxiously up the dirt mound that had let itself into the room through the window. Whatever was coming after me had opened the door and was gaining on me, but did not make a sound beside their heavy footsteps. I got out the window and slid it shut right as something pounded up against it. The whole time the woman downstairs never stopped crying. I didn't stop. I climbed out of that hole and tore through the woods. The whole way back I felt followed by a sense of hopelessness and dread. I don't remember much from the run back, but when I got home, I passed out on my couch. I woke up a few hours later, and the sun had set. I locked all of my doors and windows, scared that the thing from the house would follow me, and then I took a shower. As of now, nothing more has come of that house. I did call the police and reported the incident about a week ago, so I expect to hopefully hear from them soon. The uneasiness of my experience with that house has kept me out of the woods for good. In fact, I've kind of taken a pause on hiking alone. If there are ever updates, I can let you all know. But for now, that is everything. One day, when I was an elementary schooler, I think probably 3rd or 4th grade, I was awoken by my mum in a rush. She had overslept, and since she always woke me up in the morning, this meant that I too overslept. And now there was just no way I was going to be ready for school early enough to get on the school bus. My school started at 8 AM, and my bus pickup time was 7 AM, but it was already about 6:40 or something, and I was still in my pyjamas, and hadn't even eaten breakfast yet. So Mum decided that today, we would just tell the bus driver to go on ahead, and she would take me to school, which would give me plenty of time to get ready. So I'm sitting there at the dining room table, eating breakfast, still in my pyjamas, and it's now about 6:50, and we hear the bus pull up, about 10 minutes earlier than usual. My mum peeks her head out of the door into the foggy morning and waves the bus on. She closes the door and comes back inside, but the bus doesn't pull away. There's a knock at the door, and Mum opens it to find a man in a bus driver's uniform. He explains that he's a substitute driver because the regular driver called in sick. He says he knows he's a few minutes early since he wanted to get an early start on the route since he didn't know it that well. Mum explains to him that she was going to take me to school since we woke up late. He gets visibly upset and says that he can wait a few minutes since he's already running ahead of schedule. My mum insists that no, I won't be ready to go in a few minutes, and tells him to go on ahead. He seemed angry about this, but turned around and got back in the bus and left. I returned to eating my breakfast, and still don't have my school clothes on at this point. But at 7 AM sharp, another bus pulls up to my house. Mum thinks this is weird, and goes outside to talk to them. She comes back inside looking terrified, but doesn't really say anything about it, and tells me to finish getting ready for school. At the time, I didn't know what happened, but Mum would end up telling me a few years later. When she went to this second bus, she found that it was being driven by the regular bus driver, and it was full of all the other kids that are usually on the route. The other bus was empty, by the way. Mum asked the man about the substitute driver, and about him calling in sick. I never called in sick. There is no substitute driver on my route, he says. The driver immediately called dispatch in a panic, and told my mum to go inside and call the police and report this incident. There was absolutely no one doing my driver's route that day. Whoever this was most likely a kidnapper who had targeted me. I never heard anything about it again, not even if someone else had ended up being picked up by this mysterious fake bus driver. But chances are, had I gotten on that bus, I would never have made it to school, or back home. And if Mum hadn't overslept on that specific day, I would have been on that bus.